He reached the shore alive, and that was the last easy thing that would happen to him. No trees, no water, no voices on the wind, just sand stretching in every direction, and a sun that didn't care whether he lived or died. By the time the first ship passed the island, he had already made a choice. By the time the second ship disappeared, he was no longer sure he was still human. And years later, when smoke finally rose into the sky, the people who came looking for survivors found something they weren't prepared to see, because he shouldn't have lasted days. Yet, somehow, he was still there. The sea finally released him at dawn. Pedro Serrano collapsed onto the shore, his body barely responding as the last wave rolled past his legs. Salt burned his eyes. His lungs screamed. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. He lay there, half buried in wet sand, staring at the sky as if it might open and swallow him whole. Behind him, there was nothing. The ship that carried him across the Caribbean was gone, shattered, swallowed by the night. No cries for help, no floating wreckage, no other survivors dragging themselves ashore. Just silence. Pedro forced himself onto his elbows and scanned the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, calm now, almost mocking. If anyone else had survived the wreck, they would have surfaced by now. No one did. As the sun climbed higher, the truth settled into his bones. He was alone. When Pedro finally stood, his legs buckled beneath him. He staggered forward, moving inland, driven by instinct more than reason. The island revealed itself slowly and cruelly. It was vast, hours to cross on foot, but it was also empty. No trees, no bushes, no fresh water. Just sand, a blinding, endless expanse of sand beneath an unforgiving sun. Heat radiated upward, baking his skin. There was nowhere to hide, no shade, no sound but wind and distant waves. This was not an island. It was a sandy prison. Pedro's mouth was dry. His tongue felt swollen. Thirst pressed at him harder than fear. He searched desperately, digging, walking, crawling. But there were no streams, no ponds, no signs of life beyond insects skittering across the dunes. The year was the 1520s. Spanish galleons crossed these waters, yes. But the ocean was vast, and this island was nothing more than a forgotten. Ships could pass within miles and never know it existed. The chances of rescue were almost non-existent. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. Then hunger struck. Pedro found mollusks clinging to rocks near the shore, crawling insects hidden beneath the sand. He ate them raw, grimacing, forcing them down. Survival left no room for disgust. Later that day, something massive emerged from the sea. Giant turtles. They lumbered onto the beach with slow, ancient movements, dragging their enormous shells across the sand. Pedro's heart pounded. This was food. This was life. He ran. With desperate strength, he flipped the turtles onto their backs. Their legs flailed uselessly in the air. Using the knife he always carried at his waist, the only possession he had left, he pierced their flesh. He drank their blood, warm, metallic, reviving. Then he carved chunks of meat and laid them out in the sun to dry. The shells, once emptied, became something even more valuable. Containers. Pedro positioned them carefully, angling them to catch rain whenever the sky offered mercy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him alive. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Pedro became a creature of routine. He fashioned tools from turtle bones, hooks for fishing, scrapers for meat. He learned which insects were safe to eat. He memorized the sky, watching for clouds that might bring water. When rain finally came, he ran barefoot across the island, placing shells in precise patterns to collect every possible drop. Fire became his obsession. Driftwood washed ashore daily, useless without flame. Back in Spain, starting a fire was simple. Stones, steel, sparks. But this island offered no stones. Pedro refused to accept that fire was impossible. Day after day, he swam beyond the shallows, diving into the sea despite the burning in his lungs. He searched the ocean floor blindly, fingers scraping against coral and sand. Then, at last, he found them. Stones. He carried them back one by one, muscles screaming. Once ashore, he chipped them into sharp edges, tore his shirt into strips, and struck stone against blade again and again. A spark caught, then flame. Pedro wept as the fire took hold. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant safety. Fire meant hope. He fed it obsessively, never letting it die. Years passed. Ships appeared on the horizon, distant white sails gliding past like ghosts. Pedro built smoke signals, waving his arms until his voice gave out. No one came. Each passing ship broke him a little more. Loneliness gnawed at his mind. He spoke to the fire, to the turtles, to himself. His hair grew long and wild. His body hardened under sun. By the third year, Pedro no longer resembled a man. Then, one night, the island changed forever. A storm raged offshore. A ship struck the rocks and shattered. Its lone survivor swam through darkness, guided only by dawn's faint glow. At sunrise, the sailor saw smoke. He ran toward it, shouting in joy until he saw Pedro, a wild figure, naked, hair matted, eyes feral. The sailor froze in terror. Pedro froze too. This is a hallucination, Pedro thought. I have finally lost my mind. He screamed and ran. Jesus, save me. The sailor shouted after him, invoking faith, grounding reality. Slowly, Pedro stopped, turned, collapsed into the sailor's arms, sobbing. They were no longer alone. They survived together, fought, separated, reconciled, until after 8 long years, a ship finally noticed their smoke. Rescue came cautiously. Pedro returned to Spain a legend. He lived the rest of his life wealthy, respected, his survival story passed down through generations. He should have died in days. Instead, he survived 8 years. Because survival isn't about strength. It's about refusing to stop. The first sensation Pedro Serrano noticed was salt. Salt in his hair. Salt in his eyes. Salt clinging to every trembling muscle. Then came the pain. Every limb screamed. His lungs burned with each ragged breath. The waves had battered him for hours. Or had it been days? Leaving him alive, yet barely. He felt both relief and disbelief. He had survived. The wreckage of his ship was gone, swallowed by the relentless Caribbean, leaving no trace of its splintered hull or the cries of the men he had sailed with. He tried to remember faces, voices, the sound of the captain's orders, but the ocean had stolen them all. When Pedro crawled to the shore and dragged himself upright, the first reality hit him. He was not just stranded. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The island stretched before him, a sea of sand, unbroken except by the endless, lapping waves. No trees swayed in the wind. No bird circled the sky. No sound but the ocean, relentless and indifferent. The sun climbed higher, beating down on him with merciless heat. Each step across the fine sand burned his feet. Sweat stung his eyes. Thirst clawed at his throat. It was not just survival he needed. It was ingenuity. The first hours were devoted to finding food. Pedro combed the shore, discovering tiny mollusks clinging to rocks, crabs that skittered into holes, and insects that he ate raw, forcing them down with grim determination. The taste was bitter, metallic, strange, but life required it. Later that day, he saw the first sign of hope. Massive shapes emerged from the surf. Turtles, enormous and unbothered, lumbered onto the sand. Pedro's heart leapt. This was sustenance. This was survival. He ran toward them, knees burning, lungs heaving. Using the knife at his waist, he flipped the first turtle onto its back. Its limbs flailed helplessly. He struck decisively, drinking the warm blood as it flowed. Then he cut chunks of meat, laying them in the sun to dry. He salvaged the shells, hollowed and cleaned, to collect rainwater when the skies finally offered mercy. Night fell. Exhaustion overtook him. He dug a shallow trench in the sand, burying himself partially to keep warm, listening to the waves' monotonous rhythm. Sleep brought little comfort. Dreams of the ship, his companions, the life he had lost, haunted him. Days merged into weeks. Pedro adapted. Each sunrise brought new challenges. Finding food, protecting the fragile fire he eventually learned to create, learning which shells were reliable containers. which rocks could be broken into tools. His ingenuity grew. Bones became hooks, shells became bowls, driftwood became fuel. He experimented tirelessly until he discovered the delicate art of creating sparks from stones, igniting rags torn from his clothing to bring flame to his small fires. With fire came hope. With fire came protection. The smoke was a signal, a desperate plea for rescue, though he knew the ocean was too vast, the ships too few, and the winds unpredictable. Months passed. Pedro's hair grew long, matted and wild. His body hardened under the sun. Hunger and thirst became background sensations. He walked, ran, and slept with rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Each small triumph, a turtle dried, a shell positioned just right to catch rain, a fire that held to the night, became a lifeline. Then came the first psychological test. The isolation began to gnaw at his mind. He spoke aloud to himself, naming the turtles, the shells, even the fire. He imagined conversations, arguments, companionship. Sometimes, at night, he thought he saw shadows move across the dunes, ghosts of men he had lost at sea, or perhaps hallucinations born of desperation. Time blurred. Months became years. He lost count of seasons. Rain and sun ruled every moment, shaping him into a creature part human, part survivor. He could no longer remember the cadence of his old life. The smell of fresh bread, the feel of a shirt on clean skin, the sound of laughter untainted by isolation. Yet he endured. Pedro learned every inch of the island. He mapped in his mind, recognizing dunes, pools of collected rainwater, rocks where crabs gathered, and the precise locations where turtles emerged. He turned the island into a machine of survival. And then, as if the universe wished to test him further, a ship appeared on the horizon. White sails, fragile against the distance. Pedro's chest tightened. He waved. He shouted. Smoke from his fire billowed toward the sky. But the ship passed without notice, oblivious of the lone man clinging to life on the sand. Despair rose and fell like the tide. But Pedro's fire endured. And with fire, he endured. The second year on the island began with routine. Yet every day carried the weight of months, and every month felt like an eternity. Pedro Serrano's body had adapted to the relentless sun and salt, his skin dark and toughened, his muscles hardened by constant labor. But his mind was fragile. He spoke to the wind. He gave names to the turtles that had become both his sustenance and companions. The largest he called Domingo, for no reason other than the memory of a shipmate long lost. He argued with it, begged it for mercy, even scolded it for not appearing when the rains were scarce. The fire became another silent interlocutor. He watched the flames dance at night, imagining faces in the smoke, whispering to him of home, of Spain, of people he would never see again. Food had become less a challenge than mastery. Pedro had perfected the art of drying turtle meat. Scraping from bones with sharp-edged rocks he had spent months fashioning. He devised intricate traps for crabs, fish, and smaller mollusks. Each day was measured in survival milestones: collect water, maintain fire, hunt, and rest. He had learned to predict rainfall, track the movements of sea life, and even understand the patterns of wind and tide. Yet for all his ingenuity, the isolation gnawed at him like a persistent illness. Nights were the worst. He would lie on the sand, listening to the surf, imagining shadows moving beyond the dunes. Sometimes he swore he heard voices, low whispers calling his name, only to awaken to emptiness. Madness teased at the edges of his consciousness, and Pedro knew he could not give in. Years 2 and 3 merged. Pedro perfected his survival tools. Turtle shells were split and hollowed, becoming containers for water and storage for dried meat. Bones became fishing hooks, and driftwood carefully selected for fuel. Fire was tended like a living creature, each spark a fragile promise of life, each flame a shield against despair. Yet still the ocean mocked him. Ships passed. Always ships. White sails distant and fleeting, carrying men who could have been his saviors. Yet none noticed the smoke. None answered the frantic signals he had devised with painstaking care. Each passing vessel was a dagger to hope, a reminder that he was truly invisible, a speck lost in the vast Caribbean. Then, in the 4th year, something extraordinary happened. Pedro was walking along the eastern dunes when he noticed a figure in the shallow surf. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, A trick of light, perhaps, or some cruel mirage conjured by years of isolation. The figure struggled against the waves, body battered, arms flailing in exhaustion. Pedro froze. His heart raced, both with fear and disbelief. Another human? Instinct and isolation warred within him. For 4 years, he had been the only living soul on this island. The presence of another man was both a miracle and a terror. His first thought was self-preservation, to flee, to hide, to avoid the potential danger of contact. But then empathy surged, raw and overwhelming. The man stumbled onto the sand, collapsed, coughing and choking. Pedro ran to him cautiously, hands raised in a gesture of non-threat. The survivor, equally wary, raised his head. For a long, silent moment, they assessed one another. Then panic overtook reason. Pedro screamed. The man flinched. Pedro turned and ran, chest heaving, shouting prayers to Jesus, calling out in terror. The years of isolation had made him suspect every interaction, every voice, every movement. The other man shouted after him, invoking faith, humanity, commonality. Slowly, Pedro stopped. It took hours, the heat of the sun, exhaustion, hunger, and desperation, for him to realize this was no specter, no hallucination. Another human, alive, real. When he finally approached, cautiously, tears streamed down his face. He embraced the stranger with a desperation born of years of solitude. For the first time in 4 years, he had human contact, and it was overwhelming. They sat by the fire, sharing stories and broken words, laughter and tears mingling with the smoke that had been Pedro's solitary companion for years. Together, they adapted. 2 men were stronger than one. They could forage faster, collect water more efficiently, maintain the fire with shifts, and provide companionship that staved off the mental toll of isolation. Their routines became synchronized. One hunted while the other maintained shelter. One tended the fire while the other gathered supplies. But human nature, even in survival, is unpredictable. Friction arose. Small disputes over responsibilities escalated into bitter arguments. Pedro accused the other man of slacking. The stranger criticized Pedro's obsession with perfection and fire maintenance. Eventually, they divided the island, each claiming territory. Silence replaced conversation, and the dunes that had once echoed with tentative laughter now heard only solitude. Months passed in a strange coexistence. They avoided one another, but the routines kept them alive. Food, water, fire, the essentials of survival, remained intact. Eventually, the folly of their feud became clear. Necessity overrode pride. They reconciled, apologies whispered over the fire that had witnessed both division and survival. Their companionship, now tempered by hardship and understanding, became stronger. Yet even with 2 humans on the island, rescue remained elusive. Ships passed, waves lapped, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months into years. Hope flickered like the fire's flame, sometimes almost extinguished, only to be rekindled with rain, with turtle meat, with the knowledge that they had survived thus far. By the end of year 4, Pedro and his companion had fully adapted to the island. Shelter had been improved, turtle shells fashioned into roofs, fire maintained with rigorous attention, rainwater collection system optimized. Their bodies were hardened, their minds sharpened. They had become, in every sense, masters of this barren sandscape. But the ultimate test, rescue, remained just beyond reach. By the 5th year, Pedro Serrano and his companion had become something more than men. They were survivors forged in relentless isolation. Their bodies, lean and strong, were hardened by sun and salt water, their hands scarred from handling knives, bones, and stones. Their minds, though battered, had sharpened into precision. Every movement, every task, had a purpose. The island, once a terrifying expanse of sand and sun, had become a system, a network of survival. Rainwater collected in cleverly angled turtle shells. Dried turtle meat was rationed with meticulous care. Traps for crabs and fish were set and maintained. The fire, now almost ritualistic, was tended day and night. Every ember was a heartbeat, every smoke signal a prayer. Yet even with mastery came the gnawing awareness of time, or its illusion. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Their bodies knew hunger, thirst, and fatigue intimately, yet the mind demanded more. Hope. A ship had passed again on the horizon last month. They had waved, screamed, sent plumes of smoke into sky. Nothing. Silence answered. The isolation that had once defined Pedro now shared space with another human, but companionship was imperfect. Minor disputes still flared. Tasks were argued over. One man would accuse the other of carelessness. The other would resent perceived criticism. Yet unlike before, they could resolve their conflicts. Necessity had tempered pride, forging a bond that was both fragile and unbreakable. Pedro, in particular, had become obsessed with the mechanics of survival. He experimented relentlessly, refining rainwater collection, testing the durability of shells and bones, creating more efficient fishing tools, and even attempting rudimentary navigation experiments. The ocean was both a threat and a teacher. He learned the patterns of currents, the migrations of fish, the timing of turtle arrivals. Knowledge became survival, and survival became obsession. Night remained the cruelest teacher. The wind whispered, and Pedro would imagine shadows moving among the dunes. Sometimes he swore he saw figures, tall and thin, emerging from the sands themselves. Dreams merged with reality. His companion would shake him awake from hallucinations, whispering calm, grounding him. The mind, after 5 years of constant isolation and relentless pressure, was a fragile vessel. Then came the 6th year, a turning point, subtle yet profound. Pedro and his companion had perfected their smoke signals, building a small platform high atop a dune. From there, plumes of smoke rose farther, drifting toward the horizon with every breeze. They practiced timing, direction, and intensity, hoping to catch the attention of ships. And one day it worked. Almost. A vessel appeared, a glint of sails far off, moving slowly toward them. Hearts raced. Hands trembled. They prepared to wave, to shout, to signal with everything they had. But the ship changed course. Perhaps it had seen the rocks. Perhaps the sailors had feared danger. Perhaps fate itself had intervened. Whatever the reason, it passed. The fire burned, the smoke rose, and the men were left staring at empty water, hearts sinking. Years 7 and 8 passed in a rhythm of grim survival. The island had become a place of ritual, repetition, and resilience. Turtle meat dried and stored. Fire kept alive. Water collected. Shelter maintained. Bodies aged under sun and wind. Minds balanced between genius and madness. Then, the final year, the 8th, brought the ultimate test of their endurance. On a morning unlike any other, Pedro noticed something far off, near the horizon. White sails, closer than before. Real, not fleeting, not a mirage. The smoke of their fire rose tall, and this time it was noticed. The ship approached cautiously, aware of the treacherous rocks surrounding the island. The men could see sailors on deck, watching, unsure, tense. Pedro's companion, long accustomed to fear and caution, hesitated. But Pedro, driven by 8 years of hope, despair, and survival, screamed with all the strength he had left. He shouted prayers, names, cries of desperation. He ran down the dunes, arms flailing, heart pounding. For a tense moment, it seemed the sailors would turn away. The figures on deck were unsure, alarmed by the sight of 2 wild, disheveled men covered in sand and salt, hair long and tangled, eyes feral with isolation. But the cries, invoking faith, humanity, shared survival, broke through. Slowly, cautiously, the sailors sent a small boat ashore. Pedro and his companion ran toward it. Every step was agony. Every step was elation. They had survived impossible odds. They had endured the relentless island. They had mastered fire, water, hunger, fear, and madness. And now, finally, the world beyond the sand awaited. The rescue was cautious. The sailors were wary, unsure if these figures were man, myth, or something in between. But they were alive, real, human, and that was undeniable. As they were lifted onto the boat, Pedro looked back at the island that had been both prison and teacher, enemy and sanctuary. 8 years of sun, sand, fire, and solitude. 8 years of survival against impossible odds. 8 years that had tested every fiber, body, and mind. He had not merely survived. He had endured. He had adapted. He had conquered the island, in a way. By refusing to give in, the boat neared the shore slowly, its oars slicing through the crystal blue waves, the sailors' eyes fixed on the two figures dancing in the sand. Pedro Serrano and his companion had never imagined that they would see the world beyond the island again. Yet here it was, tangible, glinting in the sunlight. Every instinct screamed at Pedro to run, not from danger, but from disbelief. He had survived hurricanes, starvation, isolation, and madness. The idea that a vessel had finally noticed them seemed impossible. And yet it was real. The sailors hesitated. They were faced with two human forms that looked almost mythic. Wild hair, sun-cracked skin, bodies lean and hardened to the extreme, eyes unblinking, feral. For a moment, fear gripped the sailors. Were these men maroon souls, or something more savage? Pedro, desperate and unyielding, screamed again, "In the name of Jesus, help us. We are alive." The words cut through the fear, through the disbelief. Slowly, the sailors lowered a small boat. Pedro's companion grasped Pedro's hand, both men racing toward salvation. The sand burned beneath their feet, every step an agony, every step a triumph. They collapsed into the boat, gasping, shaking, laughing, and crying all at once. The rowers leaned back, astonished, witnessing two men who had survived 8 years of unimaginable hardship. Pedro looked back one final time at the island. Endless sand, relentless sun, his home and tormentor, and for the first time, he allowed himself a sigh of relief. The journey back was slow and careful. Pedro and his companion drank fresh water and ate real food for the first time in years. Their hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the shock of comfort. They shared their story in broken, fragmented sentences, unable to capture the full horror and beauty of what they had endured. Yet even in triumph, tragedy struck. Pedro's companion, weakened by the years of starvation and the shock of sudden civilization, fell ill despite the sailors' best efforts. He did not survive the journey back to Europe. Pedro was left to mourn, torn between relief and grief. The man who had shared the hardest years of his life, the man who had kept him anchored to sanity, was gone. Pedro arrived in Spain, gaunt, scarred, and almost unrecognizable. But news of his survival spread rapidly. The story of the man who had endured 8 years alone on a barren sand island captivated the nation. Scholars, sailors, and adventurers flocked to hear his tale. Books were written, ballads composed, and Pedro Serrano became a figure of legend, a symbol of human endurance and ingenuity. He dedicated his later years to aiding others lost at sea, sharing his methods for survival and mentoring explorers. The knowledge he had acquired through necessity became invaluable, and his fame allowed him to influence generations of sailors. Pedro's life had once been defined by despair and isolation. Now it was defined by resilience and legacy. The island that had been his prison had taught him lessons that no classroom could offer: patience, ingenuity, courage, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. And the world would remember him, because he should have died in days. Yet, against all odds, he survived. 8 years, alone, on a sand island.